Hi all! Today we will talk about the temporal variations in lake water temperature, paleoenvironmental implications of lake carbonate delta weighting, and temperature records. This paper was written by Michael T. Hren and Nathan D.Sheldon from the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences, University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and it was published in 2012 in the journal Earth and Planetary Science Letters. Delta weighting and clumped isotope measurements provide temperature of carbonate formation that may be used for inferring paleoelevations and terrestrial climate conditions in which it formed. But what temperature do they really record? In order to make inferences on past elevations and climate, we need to know the relationship between those temperatures and seasonal and mean annual temperatures and climate. So what does this paper here do? This paper examines surface water temperature records from 88 lakes across the globe to develop transfer functions that relate seasonal water surface temperature to mean annual air temperature. And why do they use lakes? Lacustrine carbonates, both biotic and abiotic, archive abundant geochemical information of terrestrial paleotemperature data. The oxygen isotopic composition of carbonate, or calcium carbonate, is dependent upon the bulk delta weighting composition and the temperature of the water in which it formed. This is described by this temperature-dependent fractionation equation. Here, alpha is the fractionation factor between calcium carbonate and water. This fractionation factor is also 1000 plus delta weighting of the carbonate over 1000 plus delta weighting of the water. After replacing this here into the first equation we showed, we have this relationship here. This means that if we know the delta weighting of the carbonate, we need to know either the delta weighting of the water to find out the temperature of formation, or we need to know the temperature to find the delta weighting of the water. As one may imagine, it is not always easy to know beforehand either the delta weighting of the water or temperature in paleoenvironmental reconstructions. Many studies use the best estimates for those in their calculations of either the delta weighting of the water or temperature, but this increases uncertainties on the results and interpretations. We say that these studies use conventional delta weighting thermometer. Unlike this conventional method, the recently established clumped isotope paleothermometer provides a direct measure of the temperature of carbonate formation. To calculate the temperature, this method does not require a priori knowledge of the isotopic composition of the ambient water from which carbonates formed. But despite which method is used, it is important to understand what the obtained temperature represents. We know that this temperature is the temperature of carbonate formation, which does not necessarily represent mean annual temperature. This is because the time scale of carbonate mineral formation rarely reflects a time-integrated annual average. The time scale of carbonate formation is commonly weighted to brief intervals of the year that can vary significantly due to climatic and environmental controls related to both latitude and elevation. This can impart significant uncertainty on reconstructed temperature or on calculations of delta weighting of the water composition. In the field of terrestrial paleoclimate or paleoelevation reconstructions, fundamental questions arising from this problem are: how does temperature during the period of formation of a single lacustrine carbonate relate to climate? And also, how does mean annual air temperature, like the one determined by paleobotanical estimates, relate to water temperature during the period of carbonate mineral formation? So in this paper, they analyzed lake surface temperature records and compared these with seasonal air temperature data to develop transfer functions that relate monthly and seasonal water temperature to mean annual air temperature. This approach enables the conversion of carbonate mineral formation temperature to mean annual air temperature. Now, this allows the examination of terrestrial climate, comparison of lake proxy records with paleobotanical data, and determination of paleoelevation of a lake locality using a temperature lapse rate approach. They compiled monthly lake surface temperature data from 88 lakes across the globe to relate seasonal water temperature data to mean annual air temperature. In the supplementary data, they present monthly water surface temperature and air temperature data for each of the lakes. Based on them, they calculate the averaged mean annual lake surface temperature and the mean annual air temperature. They plotted this data in Figure 1 of the paper. They found this transfer function relating mean annual lake surface temperature, MALST, and mean annual air temperature, MAAT. Determining the mean annual air temperature using water-air temperature transfer functions involves knowing the timing of lacustrine carbonate formation. But this involves knowing which carbonate are we talking about. Lacustrine carbonate is comprised of four main dominant components. The first one is inorganically precipitated carbonate. The second is photosynthesis-induced carbonate, or bio-induced carbonate. The third is biogenic carbonate consisting of debris from calcareous plants and animals. And finally, of allochthonous material derived from carbonate rocks in the lake's drainage basin. But most of the lacustrine carbonate preserved in the sedimentary record is biogenic, inorganic, or bio-induced. The timing of formation of carbonates depend on the phase, biotic or abiotic, and the environmental conditions of the lake, which impact seasonal variations in lake temperature. So, to apply the appropriate transfer function for interpreting ancient delta 18 or delta 47 data, we need to consider timescales of formation of the different phases of lacustrine carbonate. So let's talk about biotic shell carbonate. Carbonate-forming organisms in lacustrine environments generally precipitate shell material within a restricted range of temperature. Delta 18 studies of biotic carbonates, like unionid bivalves, show that shells' growth and metabolic rate are directly controlled by temperature, with strong temperature restrictions. However, other factors like turbidity, nutrient availability, and primary productivity also impact growth rates. A combination of several studies suggests that a range of shell-forming organisms at mid to high northern latitude form throughout the spring to fall period, unevenly, with mass accumulation weighted toward the April to June period. The timing of peak mass accumulation is influenced by both the attainment of critical temperature thresholds and the onset of photosynthetic activity in the spring period. So, in order to capture the integrated biotic carbonate formation temperature of mid to high northern latitude shells, we need a transfer function that relates the surface water temperature in April, May, and June, or April, May, June, July, August, September, October, to mean annual air temperature. But what about lacustrine abiotic carbonates? So in mid to high latitudes, abiotic lacustrine carbonates, like micrites, tend to form between the spring to fall. Commonly, they form in the warm months during periods of peak evaporation and when carbonate tends to become supersaturated in solution. The process for this is: warm temperature and increased nutrient flux occur during peak summer evaporation. These can help drive algal blooms that reduce the PCO2 in the upper layer of the water in a stratified lake. This upper layer is known as epilimnion. Reduced PCO2 in the water increases the pH and promotes supersaturation of the carbonate ion. This causes an event of precipitation of microcrystalline carbonate, also known as Whiting event, during a brief interval of warm lake conditions. But what is the timing in which these inorganic carbonate precipitation events, or whiting events, occur? Peak whiting events have been observed in the Northern Hemisphere lakes during the entire range of spring to fall months, so from April to October. And data suggests that there may be systematic differences in the timing of carbonate formation between open and closed evaporative lakes. In open, temperate, northern hemisphere lakes, carbonate precipitation peaks in spring, so from April to June. This is because of both temperature effects and microbial blooms that result in the uptake of dissolved inorganic carbon, or DIC, represented by CO2, driving carbonate precipitation. Examples are hardwater lakes of eastern North America and the Great Lakes. So they suggest that for these open, temperate, non-evaporative lake systems, a transfer function relating April month June AMG water temperatures to the mean annual air temperature would be the most adequate. In contrast, enclosed alkaline lakes with high dissolved magnesium to calcium ratio, carbonate nucleation may be inhibited and lake waters can achieve a higher degree of carbonate supersaturation than magnesium-poor lakes. Examples are evaporative lakes such as the Pyramid Lake in Nevada and the Great Salt Lake in Utah, which have peak periods of carbonate precipitation in August and June, respectively. This is significantly different from the spring peak from April to June observed in the freshwater lakes of North America, like the Great Lakes. This means that enclosed alkaline and saline lakes in the mid to high latitudes and in lakes that produce high magnesium calcite or aragonite, whiting events are more linked to temperature effects on carbonate solubility than to biotic uptake of CO2 in surface waters. Because these temperature effects on carbonate solubility tend to produce whiting events in the late summer, the authors suggest a transfer function that relates summer water surface temperatures to climate. These water summer temperatures would be June, July, August, JJA for the Northern Hemisphere. Now let's talk more specifically about the lake temperature, air temperature transfer functions. The 88 lakes in their database show a clear relationship between mean annual lake surface temperature and mean annual air temperature. The relationship is this one here, where the coefficient of variation is r² equal 0.96. The main observations here are: first, the lake surface temperature exceeds observed mean annual air temperature in virtually all instances. This is more pronounced in cold regions, where prolonged ice cover and cold air temperatures have the effect of insulating the lake from ambient air. Also, the relationship between lake surface temperature and mean annual air temperature varies dramatically throughout the year depending on the time scale of integration. Transfer function relationships for non-tropical Northern Hemisphere lakes where seasonal temperature variability is large are: over spring, AMJ, mean lake surface temperatures are related to mean annual air temperature through this equation, where R squared is equal to 0.935. So, carbonate formed in these lakes over spring will record temperatures about 5 degrees higher than mean annual air temperatures. Now, over peak summer periods, JJA, mean lake surface temperatures are related to mean annual air temperatures through this equation here, with R squared equal to 0.9. So, carbonate formed in these lakes over peak summer will record temperature about 10 to 15 degrees warmer than mean annual air temperature. Finally, over the period of April to October, covering the peak growing season in the Northern Hemisphere, MLST are related to mean annual air temperature through this equation here, with an R squared of 0.949. So carbonates formed during this period of integration average around 8 degrees Celsius warmer than mean annual air temperature. After showing the transfer functions, the authors spend a good part of the paper discussing the environmental controls on lake temperatures. They say that lake latitude and elevation have a strong relationship with lake water temperature. This figure here shows the relationship between latitude and temperatures of mean annual air temperature, shown as squares, June, July, August mean water temperatures, shown as diamonds, mean annual water temperature, shown as triangles, and warmest month mean water temperature, shown as circles. The main observations are: first, for tropical lakes below latitudes of 23 degrees, there is little variability in annual or seasonally weighted temperature. Also, there is relatively small offsets between air and water temperatures here. Now, for low to mid-latitude lakes, mean annual surface water temperatures are similar to mean annual air temperatures. And finally, for temperate and polar lakes, there are clear latitude water temperature profiles that are offset from mean annual air temperature profiles. In these high latitudes, lake temperature greatly exceeds those of mean annual air temperature due to the insulating effect of ice cover. Another important observation from the paper is that there is a clear relationship between global lake warmest month mean water temperature and mean annual air temperature, only for mean annual air temperatures below around 12 degrees C, as shown here by this figure. So, if carbonates form only during peak summer temperatures, proxy records cannot distinguish between climates with mean annual air temperatures of around 12 degrees C and around 25 degrees C. Also, there is a strong relationship between global lake warmest month mean water temperature and elevation, as shown by this figure here. The relationship defines a maximum surface water temperature limit. The authors suggest that any lake paleotemperature estimates above 35 degrees C for ancient non-saline lakes most likely reflect some degree of diagenetic alteration. Regarding lapse rates, while the mean annual lake surface temperature elevation relationships closely approximates to the free air lapse rate of around 6 degrees C per kilometer, lapse rates are lower for the warmest month mean water temperature versus elevation. This figure shows data from low latitude as triangles, mid latitude as circles, and high latitude as squares. Both low and high latitude lakes define comparable maximum temperature elevation lapse rates of around 3.5 to 4 degrees C per kilometer, which are considerably lower than the free air lapse rate for moist air. So for closed lake systems where micrite forms during peak warm season months, temperature elevation lapse rates are likely closer to the warmest month mean water temperature lake lapse rate of 3.5 degrees C per kilometer. Now, there are some limitations of transfer functions for paleoclimate reconstructions. First, we have an uncertainty in depth of carbonate formation. Transfer functions relate surface water temperature to climate. To use them, we need to make sure carbonates are formed on the upper several meters of the water column, above the thermocline and outside periods when temperature gradients exist in shallow waters. Another uncertainty comes from the timing of carbonate formation. The systematic controls on biotic and abiotic lacustrine carbonate formation allow reasonable estimations for the time scale of carbonate formation. But it is still difficult to determine with certainty the absolute time scale of carbonate formation for ancient lakes because it depends both on climate, controlled by elevation and latitude, and lake-specific factors such as timing of nutrient influx or evaporation. The authors suggest that we should evaluate individually each lake system and carbonate phase used for paleoenvironmental reconstruction, considering paleolatitude and past seasonality. This will help determine the appropriate transfer function that we can or will use. In one of the last sections of the paper, the authors discuss the relationship between delta 47 micrite temperatures and reconstructed mean annual air temperatures. To assess the effectiveness of using water temperature, air temperature transfer functions to determine mean annual air temperature, they compared published carbonate formation temperatures determined by delta 47 analysis for 6 modern lacustrine carbonates with measured modern mean annual air temperature for these lake sites. The main findings are shown in this figure, where circles represent measured delta 47 of carbonate, triangles represent these delta 47 values transformed into mean annual air temperatures using the JJA function, and diamonds represent the delta 47 values transformed into mean annual air temperatures using the AMJJASO function. The one-to-one line here is shown for comparison between reconstructed mean annual air temperature and actual mean annual air temperature. The delta 47 carbonate temperatures average around 8 degrees Celsius warmer than mean annual air temperature at the sample sites, and should be interpreted as a seasonal proxy representing the warm season. This table shows calculated mean annual air temperature using delta 47 of carbonate, the temperature, and seasonal water temperature, air temperature transfer functions. Plotted in this figure are the values from JJA function and AMJJASO function, showing that they reasonably reproduce modern mean annual air temperature from lacustrine carbonate delta 47 temperature, whereas uncorrected delta 47 temperatures substantially overestimate mean annual air temperatures. So to quickly summarize this paper here, the authors presented transfer functions that allow the utilization of lacustrine paleotemperature data to constrain ancient terrestrial climate, or the utilization of terrestrial temperature proxies like fossil leaves to constrain ancient water temperature to determine the delta weighting of the water in which the carbonate formed. To use these transfer functions, we always need to account for the carbonate phase, so if the carbonates are biotic or abiotic, the timescale of carbonate formation, and the relationship between water temperature and mean annual air temperature. If we fail to account for all of these factors, this can result in errors in excess of 10 degrees C when calculating the mean annual air temperature, or more than 2 per mil in delta weighting of the water when utilizing the mean annual air temperature to infer water temperature during carbonate formation.